Commander stood on the bridge of his flagship, the Eternal Dawn, and looked out at the stars. His scales shone under the cold lights of the command deck. Behind him, dozens of officers worked at their stations, preparing for what everyone believed would be an easy victory. The Empire had ruled their part of the galaxy for 3,000 years. They had conquered over 200 worlds and brought countless species under their control. No one had ever truly resisted them. No one had ever made them afraid. Had served the Empire for 60 years. He had led invasions against species that had weapons far more advanced than his own. He had crushed rebellions on a dozen planets. He had never lost a battle. When the High Command gave him this assignment, he had almost felt insulted. A young species on a small blue planet at the edge of known space. It seemed like a waste of his talents. The intelligence reports sat on his desk. He had read them many times. The species called themselves humans. They had only discovered faster-than-light travel about 100 years ago. Their ships were small and primitive compared to warships. Their planet had a population of only 12 billion, which was nothing compared to the trillions who served the Empire. They had never fought a war in space against another species. Allowed himself a small smile. This would be simple. He would arrive, demand surrender, and the humans would kneel like everyone else. If they refused, he would destroy their military and take their planet by force. Either way, the campaign would be over in weeks. His fleet consisted of 200 warships. It was actually more than he needed for a species this primitive, but the High Command wanted to send a message. They wanted the humans to see the might of the Empire and understand that resistance was pointless. On the third day of their journey, received a message from Inquisitor, who was traveling with the fleet to study the humans. Was a specialist in understanding conquered species. He knew how to find their weaknesses, how to break their will, how to make them serve the Empire willingly. "I have been studying their broadcasts," said, his voice thoughtful. "They are an interesting species, very emotional, very attached to concepts like freedom and honor." Waved his hand dismissively. "Every species values such things before they meet us. They learn quickly that survival matters more than pride." "Perhaps," replied, "but there is something unusual about their history. They have spent most of their existence fighting each other, war after war after war. They seem almost designed for conflict." "Then they have exhausted themselves fighting among themselves," said. "They will have no strength left to fight us." Did not look convinced, but he said nothing more. 2 weeks later, the fleet entered the system that the humans called Sol, ordered his ships to approach the third planet slowly, giving the humans time to see what was coming for them. He wanted them to count the warships. He wanted them to understand. When they were close enough, broadcast his message. It was the same message the Empire had sent to hundreds of worlds before. "People of Earth," he said, his voice translated into the human languages. "I am commander of the Imperial fleet. Your world now belongs to the Empire. You will surrender your military forces, your governments, and your resources. In exchange, you will be allowed to live as subjects of the Empire. Resist, and you will be destroyed. You have 1 day to respond." He ended the transmission and waited. On most worlds, the response came within hours. Leaders would beg for mercy. Populations would panic. Surrender would follow. The hours passed. No response came. Felt a flicker of annoyance. Perhaps the humans were too primitive to understand the message. Perhaps they were foolish enough to think they could hide. He ordered his fleet to move closer. Then his sensor officer made a sound that had never heard before. It was almost like a gasp of disbelief. "Commander," the officer said, his voice shaking, "you need to see this." Walked to the sensor station and looked at the display. At first, he did not understand what he was seeing. The asteroid belt between the 4th and 5th planets was showing thousands of energy signatures. They had not been there before. "What is this?" demanded. "Ships, Commander, human ships. They were hiding among the asteroids. Their engines were cold, so our sensors did not detect them." As watched, the signatures began to move. They emerged from the asteroid belt like a swarm of insects, spreading out into formations that he did not recognize. He counted them. 1,000, 2,000, 3,000. That is impossible, said. The intelligence report said they had fewer than 500 military vessels. The reports were wrong, Commander. On the planet below, Admiral Park stood in the command center of the United Earth Defense Force. She was 70 years old, with gray hair and eyes that had seen too many battles. She had spent her entire life preparing for this moment, even when others told her it would never come. Beside her stood Captain, her most trusted officer. He was young for his rank, only 40, but he had a mind for tactics that had never seen before. He thought in ways that surprised even her. They took the bait, said, watching the display that showed the fleet. They came straight in just like you predicted. Nodded slowly. Arrogance. It is always the same. They have conquered so many worlds that they have forgotten what it means to face a real enemy. Do you think we can win? Asked quietly. Was silent for a long moment. The truth was that she did not know. They had technology that humans could barely understand. Their ships were larger, stronger, better protected. By every logical measure, humanity should lose this war. But had learned something in her 70 years. War was not always decided by logic. Sometimes it was decided by will. Sometimes it was decided by how much a species was willing to sacrifice. We do not need to win today, she finally said. We only need to make them bleed. We need to show them that conquering Earth will cost them more than it is worth. We need to make them afraid. She turned to face the officers in the command center. These were the men and women who would lead humanity's defense. Some of them would die in the coming hours. All of them knew it. Send the signal, ordered. All fleets engage. Across the solar system, human ships powered up their weapons. Pilots climbed into their fighters. Soldiers prepared for battle. 12 billion people on Earth looked up at the sky and waited. In his command chair on the Eternal Dawn, Commander watched the human fleet approach. There were so many of them. Where had they all come from? How had they hidden so many ships? For the first time in 60 years, felt something cold settle in his stomach. It took him a moment to recognize the feeling, because it had been so long since he had experienced it. It was doubt. And beneath the doubt, buried so deep that he almost did not notice it, was the first small seed of fear. The battle for Earth was about to begin. The first shots of the war were fired above Mars. Commander had positioned his heavy cruisers in a wall formation, a tactic that had worked against every enemy that had ever faced. The large ships created an overlapping shield of firepower that could destroy anything that approached. Behind them, the smaller destroyers waited to chase down any survivors. Expected the humans to attack in waves, throwing their primitive ships against his defenses until they broke. That was how weaker species always fought. They did not have the discipline or the training to do anything else. He was wrong. Lieutenant sat in the cockpit of her fighter leading the squadron known as the Black Wolves. She was 32 years old and had been flying since she was 16. Her father had been a pilot. Her grandfather had been a pilot. Flying was in her blood. Around her, 49 other pilots waited for the signal. They had trained for this moment for years, practicing maneuvers that pushed their bodies to the breaking point. Many pilots had died during training. Those who survived were the best humanity had ever produced. Black Wolves, this is Wolf Leader, said into her radio. We go in fast and we go in hard. Target their sensor arrays first. Blind them, then hurt them. Nobody dies for nothing today. Understood. 49 voices answered as one. Understood. The signal came, pushed her throttle forward, and her fighters screamed toward the formation. On the Eternal Dawn, watched the human fighters approach. They were so small, barely larger than escape pods. His weapons officers laughed at the sight. What could such tiny ships do against warships? Then the humans did something impossible. Squadron reached the edge of the formation and suddenly changed direction. The turn was so sharp, so violent, that it should have killed every pilot instantly. No living creature could survive such forces, but the humans did not die. They completed the turn and dove straight into the gaps between the cruisers. Leaned forward in his chair. How are they doing that? His science officer was staring at his instruments with wide eyes. Their bodies, Commander, they can withstand acceleration forces that would kill any. Their bones are denser. Their muscles are stronger. They have redundant organs and a cardiovascular system that can handle extreme stress. They are built for war, whispered. Inside the formation, and her squadron unleashed their weapons. Human engineers had studied energy shields for decades and had found a simple solution. Do not use energy weapons. Instead, the fighters carried that fired solid metal projectiles at incredible speeds. The projectiles punched through shields like they were not there. Sensor arrays exploded. Communication dishes shattered. In the first 30 seconds of combat, half of the fleet lost the ability to coordinate. Shouted orders trying to regain control. His ships turned to target the fighters, but the humans were too fast, too agile. They danced between the cruisers, striking and retreating before the gunners could aim. Then the main human fleet arrived. Admiral had divided her forces into 3 groups. The first group attacked from above. The second attacked from below. The third came straight at the formation from the front. It was a simple tactic, but it worked because they had never faced an enemy who could coordinate so precisely. Captain commanded the frontal assault from his battleship, the Soul's Pride. He watched the formation begin to crumble as his ships poured fire into their lines. Concentrate on their engines, he ordered. A ship that cannot move is a ship that cannot fight. Human missiles streaked across the void. These were not the crude weapons they had expected. Human engineers had spent decades preparing for this war. The missiles carried nuclear warheads that detonated against hulls, overwhelming their shields through sheer destructive force. In the first hour of battle, 30 warships were destroyed or disabled. Could not believe what he was seeing. His mighty fleet, the pride of the Empire, was being torn apart by a species that had barely left their own planet. He gave an order he had never given before in his entire career. All ships retreat to the outer system, regroup at the 5th planet. The fleet pulled back. Human ships pursued them for a while but did not follow into deep space. They had won the first battle, but Admiral knew the war was far from over. On the Soul's Pride, Captain stood beside Admiral as they reviewed the battle data. They had lost 200 ships and over 3,000 lives. It was a heavy price, but they had proven something important. They can be beaten, said. Nodded slowly. Today, yes, but they will learn from this. They will adapt, and they will bring more ships. Then we will adapt faster. Looked at the young captain and saw the fire in his eyes. It was the same fire she had seen in her own eyes when she was his age. The fire that refused to accept defeat. Get some rest, she told him. Tomorrow we begin preparing for the next battle. Far away on a damaged cruiser limping towards safety, a young officer named worked in the medical bay. He was not a warrior. He was a scholar, assigned to the fleet to study conquered species. He had never expected to see actual combat. Around him, wounded soldiers groaned in pain. Many would not survive. The medical bay was overwhelmed, the doctors exhausted. Moved between the beds, doing what he could to help. As he worked, he thought about what he had witnessed. The humans had fought with a ferocity he had never seen before. They had attacked without hesitation, without any apparent fear of death. He pulled out his recording device and began to speak. Personal log, Cultural Studies Division. Today I witnessed my first battle against the species known as humans. What I saw has challenged everything I believed about warfare and survival. He paused, looking at a soldier who had lost both legs to human round. The humans do not fight like other species. They do not calculate the odds of victory before engaging. They do not retreat when the situation becomes unfavorable. They simply fight with every weapon they have until they win or until they die. He lowered his voice, speaking words he would never say in front of his commanders. I am beginning to think that we have made a terrible mistake. The Empire believed that this would be an easy conquest. I no longer believe that. These humans are something we have never encountered before. Ended his recording and sat down heavily on an empty bed. His hands were covered in the blood of his fellow. Outside the medical bay, he could hear the sounds of the damaged ship struggling to stay together. The war had only just begun, but already knew one thing with absolute certainty. The humans would not surrender. They would not break. They would fight until the very last one of them was dead. And that thought, more than anything else, filled him with a fear he could not name. The message sent to the High Command was simple: send reinforcements or lose the war. For 3 days he waited. His damaged fleet hid among the moons of the outer planets, licking its wounds while human patrol ships searched for them. Every hour, more soldiers died from their injuries. Every hour, morale dropped lower. When the response finally came, felt relief wash over him. 500 additional warships were on their way. The High Command had also sent someone else. Inquisitor would take charge of the psychological campaign against the humans. Arrived on a fast transport ship 2 weeks later. He was tall with scales that had faded to gray from age. His eyes were cold and calculating. He had broken the will of countless species during his long career. Tell me about them, said as he sat down in his command room. Described everything he had witnessed. The impossible maneuvers, the weapons that ignored shields, the way the humans had attacked without any concern for their own survival. Listened carefully, then asked a question that surprised. Have you studied their history? Their history, why would that matter? Because history tells us who a species truly is. Activated a display screen and began showing images. I have spent the journey here studying everything we captured from their broadcasts. What I found disturbed me greatly. The images showed human history, war after war after war, conflicts that lasted years, decades, sometimes centuries, weapons that grew more terrible with each generation, cities destroyed, populations wiped out, and yet somehow humanity always survived. They always rebuilt. They always came back stronger. They have been fighting since before they could write, said quietly. They have killed more of their own kind than most species lose to natural disasters, and yet they did not destroy themselves. Do you understand what that means? Shook his head. It means they have evolved for war, not against other species, against themselves. They are their own greatest enemy, and they have survived. What chance do we have against creatures who have spent thousands of years learning to destroy the most dangerous thing they ever faced? Each other. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Can you break them? Finally asked. Was silent for a long time. I do not know, he admitted, but I will try. The reinforced fleet moved back into the inner system and surrounded Earth. They established a blockade, cutting off supplies from the outer colonies and the asteroid mining stations. Then they began bombing military targets from orbit. Broadcast messages every day, promising mercy to any humans who surrendered. He offered food, medicine, safety. He showed images of conquered species living peaceful lives under rule. No one surrendered. Weeks turned into months. The siege continued. Human resistance never wavered. On the surface of Earth, Sergeant Han led his unit through the mountains of what had once been called Korea. They had landed ground forces, trying to establish bases from which to control the population. His job was to make sure those bases never felt safe. He was 45 years old, a career soldier who had served in 3 different wars before the aliens came. His face was. His hands were rough. He had buried more friends than he could count. His unit consisted of 60 soldiers, the survivors of a regiment that had once numbered over 1,000. They lived in caves, ate whatever they could find, and attacked whenever the opportunity presented itself. Tonight, they were going to destroy a supply depot. Gathered his soldiers in a small clearing. Their uniforms were torn and dirty. Their weapons were a mix of military rifles and captured alien technology. They looked like ghosts, thin and exhausted. "The depot is guarded by 200 soldiers," said. "We have 60. Those are not good numbers." His soldiers laughed quietly. They had faced worse odds before. "We go in silent, plant the charges, get out before they know we were there. If something goes wrong, we fight our way out. No one gets left behind. Understood?" "Understood, Sergeant." They moved through the darkness like shadows, had learned that they had poor night vision compared to humans. They relied too much on their technology, their sensors, their shields. They had forgotten how to fight in the dirt. The attack went perfectly for the first 10 minutes. They reached the depot, planted their explosives, and began to withdraw. Then a patrol stumbled onto them by accident. The night exploded into chaos. Killed the first soldier with his knife before the alien could raise its weapon. Around him, his soldiers opened fire. The base came alive with alarms and searchlights. "Fall back," shouted. "Detonate the charges." The depot exploded in a ball of fire that lit up the mountain. Soldiers poured out of their barracks, firing wildly into the darkness. This unit ran, carrying their wounded, leaving nothing behind for the enemy to find. They lost 12 soldiers that night, 12 more names that would carry with him until he died. But the depot was destroyed. They would go hungry for another week. In orbit, watched the explosion from the observation deck of his ship. He had requested transfer to the occupation force, hopping to study the humans more closely. What he found had only deepened his fear. He had interviewed captured humans, trying to understand how they thought. Most refused to speak at all. Those who did speak showed no fear of death, no concern for their own survival. They only cared about one thing: protecting their people. One prisoner stayed in his memory, a medic named, captured during a raid on a field hospital. She was young, barely 30, with gentle hands that had healed hundreds of wounded soldiers. The interrogators had worked on her for 3 days. They used every technique had taught them. She did not break. On the 3rd day was allowed to speak with her. He found her sitting in her cell, bruised but calm. She looked at him without hatred, which surprised him. "Why do you not surrender?" he asked her. "You must know you cannot win. Our empire is vast. Our resources are endless. Even if you defeat this fleet, we will send another, and another. Eventually, you will fall." Looked at him with eyes that had seen too much suffering. "You think this is about winning? Is it not?" She shook her head slowly. "We fight because we must, because surrender means giving up everything that makes us human, our freedom, our dignity, our right to choose our own future." She leaned forward, her voice soft but firm. "You can kill us. You can destroy our cities, burn our world, wipe out our entire species, but you cannot make us kneel, not ever." Did not know how to respond. He had studied many conquered species. All of them had eventually accepted their fate. All of them had learned to serve. But looking into his eyes, he knew that humans were different. They would rather die than submit. He left the cell and walked to his quarters in silence. That night, he wrote in his personal log, "I have come to believe that we cannot win this war. Not because the humans are stronger than us, or smarter, or more advanced. We cannot win because they will never stop fighting. They will resist with their last breath, their last bullet, their last drop of blood. And even if we kill them all, the memory of their resistance will inspire others across the galaxy to stand against us." He paused, then added one final sentence. "We have awakened something terrible, and I do not think we can put it back to sleep." 8 months into the siege, The fleet was dying. Not from human attacks, though those had been constant and brutal. The fleet was dying from exhaustion. Supply ships were being intercepted before they could arrive. Crews were working double shifts just to keep the damaged vessels functioning. Soldiers who had expected a quick victory were now counting the days until they could go home. Commander stood on his bridge and looked at the reports. Morale was at its lowest point in the history of the military. Soldiers were refusing orders. Officers were questioning his decisions openly. Some crews had even tried to desert, stealing shuttles and fleeing into deep space. The humans had not broken. Instead, they had broken the Inquisitor had tried everything: psychological warfare, targeted assassinations, offers of peace that became more generous with each passing week. Nothing worked. The humans simply refused to acknowledge that they were supposed to lose. "We should withdraw," said during a command meeting. "Regroup, return with a larger force." Slammed his fist on the table. "Withdraw? The Empire has never retreated from a conquest. Never. "Then we will be the first fleet to be destroyed by a primitive species," replied coldly. "Our soldiers are exhausted, our ships are falling apart, and the humans grow stronger every day while we grow weaker." Wanted to argue, but he knew was right. The humans had been building new ships in hidden facilities throughout the solar system. Every week, more vessels joined their fleet. Every week, their attacks became bolder. He was about to give the order to withdraw when his communications officer interrupted. "Commander, we are detecting a massive energy signature from the planet's moon." Turned to look at the display. What he saw made his blood run cold. From hidden bases on Luna, from asteroid facilities that had somehow escaped detection, from every corner of the solar system, human ships were emerging. Not the small defense fleet they had faced before. This was something else entirely. 3,000 warships, newly built and armed with weapons that glowed with terrible power. They moved in perfect formation, spreading out to surround the fleet from every direction. Admiral Park stood on the bridge of her new flagship, the Unbroken. She was tired. 8 months of siege had aged her more than the previous 20 years combined, but she was also ready. "All ships, this is Admiral Park," she broadcast to her fleet. "Operation Dawn Hammer begins now. We end this today." Beside her, Captain gave the order to attack. The battle that followed would be remembered for centuries. Human ships struck the formation with overwhelming force. Rounds and nuclear missiles tore through shields that had held for 3,000 years. Cruisers that had conquered entire worlds were reduced to burning wreckage in minutes. Captain, now commanding her own destroyer, led a squadron directly at the eternal dawn. She had lost count of how many friends had died during the siege. Her co-pilot from the first battle, her wingman from the second, the young pilot who had saved her life during a raid last month. All of them were gone. Today, she would honor their memory. "Target their engines," she ordered. "Disable, do not destroy. The Admiral wants their commander alive." Her squadron moved like a single organism, each ship supporting the others. They tried to flee, but there was nowhere to go. Human ships were everywhere, cutting off every escape route. On the eternal dawn, watched his fleet die around him. Ships that had served the Empire for centuries were exploding like fireworks. Thousands of soldiers were dying every minute, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. "Commander," his first officer said, voice shaking, "we have lost 70% of our fleet. We must surrender." Surrender. The word tasted like poison in his mouth. No commander had ever surrendered. It was the ultimate shame, worse than death. But as he looked at the faces of his crew, he saw something he had never seen before. Fear. Not the healthy fear of battle, but the deep, terrible fear of complete destruction. These were his people. He had led them into this disaster. He owed them the chance to survive. "Broadcast our surrender," said quietly. "All ships cease fire." The guns fell silent. Human ships surrounded the survivors, herding them together like animals. It was over. On the surface of Earth, Sergeant Han received the news through a crackling radio. He was in the middle of a firefight with ground forces when the message came through. All units, the enemy fleet has surrendered. Repeat, the enemy fleet has surrendered. For a moment could not process the words. Then his soldiers began to cheer. They threw down their weapons and embraced each other, crying and laughing at the same time. Walked to the edge of the battlefield and looked up at the sky. He could see the lights of ships moving in orbit, human ships, victorious ships. After 8 months of fighting, of hiding, of watching his friends die one by one, it was finally over. He thought about the soldiers he had lost, the depot raids, the ambushes, the desperate last stands. All of it had led to this moment. "We did it," he whispered to no one in particular. "We actually did it." In orbit, Admiral watched the ships power down their weapons. She felt no joy. Too many people had died for her to feel joy. But she did feel something else, pride. Humanity had faced an empire that had never known defeat. They had been outnumbered and outmatched in every measurable way. And they had won. Not because they were stronger, not because they were smarter, but because they refused to give up. Captain stood beside her, equally exhausted but equally proud. "What happens now?" he asked. Considered the question. The war was over, but the work was just beginning. They would need to negotiate peace. They would need to rebuild. They would need to prepare for the possibility that the Empire might send another fleet. "Now we show them who we are," she said. "Not as enemies, as equals. We make them understand that humanity will never be conquered. Not today, not ever." She turned to face her crew. These were the men and women who had fought beside her through the darkest days of the siege. They had lost friends, family, everything that mattered, but they had never stopped fighting. "Today we are not just survivors," announced. "Today we are victors, and the galaxy will never forget what we achieved here." Far below, on the surface of Earth, emerged from his shelter with his hands raised in surrender. Human soldiers surrounded him, their weapons pointed at his chest. He expected to be shot. Instead, a young soldier lowered her rifle and offered him water. "The war is over," she said simply. "You are our prisoner now. You will be treated fairly." Took the water with trembling hands. He had studied humans for 8 months. He had watched them fight, suffer, and die. But this simple act of mercy surprised him more than anything else. These creatures who had fought with such ferocity, who had refused to surrender even when all hope seemed lost, were capable of compassion even toward their enemies. Finally understood why they had lost. It was not because humans were better warriors. It was because they were better at everything: war and peace, hatred and mercy, destruction and creation. They were the most complete species he had ever encountered. And that, more than their weapons or their tactics, was what made them truly terrifying. The peace negotiations took place on a station at the edge of the solar system. It was neutral ground, built specifically for this moment. Human engineers had constructed it in just 3 weeks, another demonstration of the species' impossible work ethic. Commander walked through the corridors of the station, flanked by diplomats and guards. His scales had lost their shine. His eyes were hollow. The proud warrior who had arrived at Earth 8 months ago was gone, replaced by a broken officer who had witnessed the destruction of everything he believed in. Admiral Park waited for him in the main conference room. She sat at a long table with her advisors, Captain, and a dozen other officers who had led humanity through its darkest hour. They wore their dress uniforms, clean and pressed, a sharp contrast to the ragged survivors had grown used to seeing. He sat down across from her and studied her face. She was old, older than any commander would be allowed to serve, but her eyes were sharp and clear. She looked at him not with hatred or contempt, but with something that might have been understanding. "Commander," she said, her voice calm, "shall we begin?" The negotiations lasted 3 days. The Empire agreed to recognize Earth and its colonies as sovereign territory. They agreed to withdraw all military forces from the solar system. They agreed to pay reparations for the damage caused during the siege. In exchange, humanity agreed to release all prisoners. They agreed not to pursue the retreating fleet. They agreed to open diplomatic relations with the Empire. It was a fair treaty, far more generous than any that had ever offered to a conquered species. Could have demanded more. She could have humiliated the Empire, forced them to crawl and beg. Instead, she offered them dignity. On the final day, after the documents were signed, found himself alone with the human admiral. The others had left to celebrate or rest. Only the two of them remained in the conference room. "May I ask you something?" said. Nodded. "Why did you fight so hard? You could have surrendered. We would have let you live. Your people would have survived under our rule as hundreds of other species have survived." Was quiet for a long moment. She looked out the window at the stars, at the same stars that had once believed belonged to his empire. "Because we are human," she finally said. "We do not kneel, not to anyone, not for any reason. Even if it means your own destruction." Even then, she turned to face him. "You see surrender as survival. We see it as death. A slow death, perhaps, but death nonetheless. We would rather die on our feet than live on our knees." Thought about her words. He had conquered species that were older than humanity, wiser than humanity, more powerful than humanity. All of them had eventually accepted rule. All of them had decided that survival was more important than pride. But these humans were different. They valued something more than survival. They valued freedom, and they were willing to pay any price to keep it. "You are a terrifying species," admitted. Smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "We know." The fleet departed the solar system the next day. Stood on the bridge of the eternal dawn, watching Earth grow smaller in the display. He would never return. He would spend the rest of his life far from this corner of the galaxy, trying to forget what he had witnessed here. But he knew he would never forget. None of them would. Back on Earth, the celebrations lasted for weeks. Cities that had been darkened during the siege blazed with light. People danced in the streets, crying and laughing and holding each other. The war was over. They had survived. Admiral did not celebrate. She retreated to a small house by the ocean, a place she had bought decades ago but never had time to visit. She sat on the porch and watched the waves, thinking about everything that had happened. Captain visited her on the third day. He found her looking older than ever, as if the weight of the war had finally caught up with her. "The government wants to give you a medal," he said, "the highest honor they can bestow." Shook her head. "Give it to someone else. I did not win this war alone." "Then accept it on behalf of everyone who fought." She considered this, then nodded slowly. "Very well, but only if the ceremony is short." Smiled. Even in victory, she was the same practical leader he had always known. "I will make sure of it." He sat down beside her, and they watched the ocean together in silence. After a while, he asked the question that had been bothering him since the war ended. "What happens now? That will tell the rest of the galaxy about us. Other empires will know that we exist, that we defeated one of the most powerful fleets in known space. Some of them might see us as a threat." Nodded. "They might. Should we be worried?" She thought about this for a long time. "Perhaps, but I think we should also be proud. We showed the galaxy that humans will not be conquered. We showed them that freedom is worth fighting for. And maybe, somewhere out there, other species heard that message. Maybe some of them are starting to believe that they can fight too." In the years that followed, his words proved true. Stories of Earth's resistance spread across the galaxy. Species that had served for centuries began to question their masters. Rebellions broke out on a dozen worlds. The great empire that had seemed eternal began to crumble. Became one of the most famous scholars in the galaxy. He published his observations of humans, a document that was translated into hundreds of languages and read by billions of beings. His final assessment became required reading in military academies across known space. "Do not fight the humans," he wrote. "Do not threaten what they love. Do not corner them, for they will never stop fighting. They are not the strongest species nor the most advanced, but they possess something no other species has mastered, the absolute refusal to accept defeat. Against such will, even empires must eventually fall." Sergeant Han returned to his village after the war. He planted a garden, married a woman he had known since childhood, and lived a quiet life. Sometimes, late at night, he would dream of the friends he had lost. He would wake up with tears on his face and go outside to watch the sunrise. He never forgot them. None of the survivors ever did. Captain took command of the New Earth Defense Fleet. She trained the next generation of pilots, teaching them the maneuvers that had saved humanity. She was strict but fair, and her students loved her. Captain eventually became Admiral of the combined human forces. He expanded humanity's reach into the stars, establishing colonies and alliances with species who had once feared them. He never forgot the lessons of the war, that strength alone was not enough, that wisdom and mercy were just as important as firepower. And Admiral Park lived out her final years by the ocean, watching the waves and thinking about the future. She had saved her species. She had changed the galaxy. But in the end, she was just an old woman who wanted peace. She died on a quiet morning, surrounded by friends and family. Her last words were simple: "We did not kneel." Across the galaxy, in the halls of empires and the councils of federations, a new truth had taken hold. It was whispered in the corridors of power, taught in military academies, spoken in reverent tones by those who had witnessed it firsthand. When humans enter the battlefield, fear follows. Not because they are invincible, not because they cannot be killed, but because they will never, ever stop fighting. They will resist with their last breath, their last bullet, their last drop of blood, and even if they fall, their example will inspire others to stand up. That is the true power of humanity. Not strength, not intelligence, not technology. Will, and will cannot be defeated. The end.